Let's hope so.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the DME for Peace community. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, the best, most innovative, and greatest learning there is in the evaluation field. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I'm the Senior Communications Associate for DME for Peace at Search for Common Ground. We're based in Washington, D.C., and Jack is currently on annual leave. And though that sounds wonderful, I'm excited that it gives me the chance to lead today's fantastic discussion. So today, I'm delighted to welcome Phil Vernon, report writer and consultant. Phil will be assisted by Scarlett Kassimatis of Peace Direct as they lead our discussion on demonstrating the impact of locally led peace building. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. I'll now hand over to today's guest, Phil. You're very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Fine, thanks. So,
wonderful,
as you said, I'm here with Scarlett, but we've agreed to make it simple. I'll do the presentation, and then Scarlett can also chip in during the discussion, the Q&A. What we'll So basically, just to say what we'll cover in this presentation, there's just, I think, 7 or 8 slides. We'll talk about the background for the research, why we did it, the approach we took to do the research, and then we'll get into the findings, which includes some conclusions that sort of we teased out of the data about what seems to work and why for local peace building, as well as some of the challenges which are faced, and then areas where more support for local peace building would be helpful, and some more specific recommendations. It'll be a fairly rapid run through without getting into too much of the detail. The report does have quite a bit of detail, but the report is online in the full version, the summary version, and indeed on internet format, interactive format. And if you haven't got the web address already, we'll put it up on the final slide, so you can, if you wish, you can review the detail and even access some of the source documents which are referenced in it. So in terms of the background, I think the good news is that peace building is becoming more and more widely accepted internationally as a critical part of the global humanitarian and development tool chest. And everyone pretty much accepts that peace is only sustainable if it's locally owned and if peace building is locally led. But international funding and support doesn't yet match this rhetoric, as I'm sure everyone listening to this is already aware. This is partly due to risk aversion on the part of the internationals, partly, to be honest, to a certain amount of prejudice, and also to constraints in how the internationals operate, their systems and their culture, essentially. But it's also down to a genuine skepticism that local peace building doesn't make enough of a difference and doesn't do so on a sufficient scale. And this skepticism is often reinforced by the lack of accessible M&E data on the impact of local peace building initiatives for decision makers in the system. So the report was designed to help fill the data gap and go some way to reduce the skepticism. The timing of the report is it was timed to be available for the advocacy starting this week with a high-level political forum on SDG 16 in New York. The report was led by Peace Direct in partnership with Alliance for Peace Building. So the approach we took to the research, we had limited resources, limited time. It was designed to help fill the data gap, but it's only a start. I want to make that really clear. Where we got the data was that Peace Direct and Alliance for Peace Building made a public call for evaluation data on local peace building initiatives. This was sent out to at least 1,600 peace builders, and we also did a fair amount of online searching for additional examples. And just to say, when we talk about local peace building, in the broadest sense, what we mean is initiatives that are led and implemented by non-internationals, people or organizations. In other words, people doing peace building in their own context and in a leading position, and not just implementing other people's programs. But the word local doesn't refer to just a very small scale. A national level initiative is also local in this context if it's led and implemented by people from the context, in the context. So we received over 250 documents, and we looked at these from the perspective of 4 criteria. One was, were they indeed locally defined and locally led? And we did include local initiatives which were part of larger programs, for example, programs led by international NGOs, provided it was clear from the evaluation that the local peace builders had a sufficient degree of autonomy and that their inputs and impacts were clearly differentiated in the report. The second criterion was, roughly speaking, was the evaluation clearly independent and objective? Third one was it done with sufficient rigor and quality? And that was more of a sense test rather than having any particular way of measuring that. So we rejected ones which were sloppy, and we included ones which seemed rigorous. And then the fourth one, after doing the call for proposals, we decided we would focus only on the Global South. We had received a handful of documents concerning initiatives in, for example, Northern Ireland and the USA. Not many, but a few. But we excluded them because we thought the target of our report is really the aid industry or the aid sector. And of course, that doesn't fund activities in places like Northern Ireland and the US. So using these criteria, we retained 57 of the documents, which was about a quarter. Most of the context they covered were in Africa, as you can see from the pie chart. That's one of the sort of odd artifacts of the way we got the data, I think. I would say that the sample, although there were a fair number of reports there, the sample was quite narrow in terms of what it covered, what kinds of activities were covered. And I think it was skewed by our data gathering method and the fact that we didn't have a year to gather much more data from all sorts of different sources. It's also skewed by the fact that our source materials are evaluations, which are kind of snapshots in time. And so it was quite difficult to assess sustainability, for example, unless that was something which was clearly assessed by the evaluators. So because of these difficulties, we decided not to do too much quantified analysis, nor draw sort of absolutely definitive conclusions. So we took more of a case study approach. However, there was enough there to say that local peace building can and does make a difference, luckily, not surprisingly, and to draw out some lessons learned. So it's a useful start and one that we think can and should be built on. And just to say, it was desk research, so we didn't visit any programs, nor did we really verify the data in any formal way. However, I think it's right to say that all of the activities mentioned in the report, we've gone back and checked with the organizations or the people doing the initiatives to make sure that they were okay with us publishing, using them in the report. So I think they all agreed. So findings. I think, so one thing, we hadn't quite sort of worked this out before we started, but peace building is a broad church. Now, probably most peace builders, if they sat around a table, would agree roughly on what they mean by peace building. The problem is when you draw in initiatives from lots of different places and people and organizations, each initiative is framed in its own terms and therefore evaluated in its own terms. And so we had to establish some kind of common framework through which we could analyze and review and discuss them. And on this slide, you'll see the two ways we did this. One is that out of the data, out of the 57 documents we had, there were 3 sort of broad clusters or categories of peace building which emerged quite organically from the data. And we used these as a basis for the 3 main chapters in the long version of the report. One was community-based peace initiatives. The second one was initiatives led by or engaging with very specific groups, for example, women, young people, or traumatized people. And the third one was initiatives that advocated improved policies and an improved discourse at the national level. Obviously, these are imperfect, and there was quite a bit of overlap between them, but they worked okay for our purposes. And I should make it clear that we completely understand that they're not exclusive. There are other initiatives that don't fit neatly into those 3 categories, but they worked for our data set. They simply served the purpose of helping us organize the research we were doing. The largest number were the first category, the community-based initiatives. And the initiatives operating on a national scope are relatively few. There were also surprisingly few evaluations of women's initiatives, which I found quite surprising given how common they are. And also very few initiatives designed to counter violent extremism, which are also becoming increasingly common. But perhaps that reflects that those are relatively recent. Secondly, if you look at the table on the right, We needed a framework for sort of considering impact. And again, everyone's got a different framework, so how to do that? Well, we came up with the concept shown in the 3x3 table on the right, and I'll just sort of talk us through that. This considers the depth or levels of impact, and that's shown in the columns, or if you like, across the x-axis, with changes in knowledge and attitudes on the left, moving rightwards through changes in people's behaviors, and ultimately to changes in structural norms, systems, and institutions in the right-hand column. And then on the rows, or the y-axis, on the other hand, we simplified all of peace building, and I know that it's a big thing to do. Peace building is, after all, a very complex field. We took it upon ourselves, for the purposes of this report, to simplify it into just 3 domains of impact. The first one of which is preventing, reducing, or stopping violence, which is the first row. The second one is improving relations and relationships between and among people and peoples, what is sometimes called horizontal relationships. And the third one is improving relations between people and those in positions of power and authority, which often is called vertical relationships. So what we're saying with this table is that at its simplest, peace equals stopping or avoiding violence, plus good, trusting, functional relationships between people, and good, trusting, functional relationships between people and those in power over those people. And that progress towards peace, or peace building, can be measured in terms of changes in knowledge and attitudes and behaviors, changes in knowledge and attitudes, changes in behaviors, and then ultimately changes in structural norms. The good news is that the report includes examples of independently evaluated local peace building initiatives that have achieved impacts for all 9 of the fields, or the blank boxes in the table. The report, of course, has the details of these. Just to illustrate at this point, we've shown 3 examples in the slide. So if we look at line 1, under the violence prevented, reduced, or stopped category, we have early warning systems actually adopted in communities in Sudan, and there were other examples as well, and many examples of local stakeholders in different places telling evaluators that they felt safer as a result of the local peacebuilding initiatives. And these we reported as structural changes because they had been adopted and they seem to have been becoming rooted in place. In line 2, under the horizontal relationships, we have improved empathy and trust between neighboring ethnic groups. And this, for example, was reported by evaluators in South Sudan and in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these, of course, are changes in knowledge and attitudes rather than behaviors or structural changes. And then in line 3, under changes in behavior linked to vertical relations, we have the fact that security services in East and West Africa were found to have adopted less repressive, more open, softer, collaborative, and actually eventually more effective approaches with the communities that they were policing. So that's just 3 examples of how we use the framework in the report. So what seems to work? I think none of this is going to come as a huge surprise to anyone, but it's interesting that that it came out of the data. Again, there is more detail in the report, but broadly a handful of common success factors emerged. These are listed on the left-hand column on the slide that's on your screens, I hope. So local initiatives often seem to have had a cumulative impact, not surprising. Indeed, in some cases, they actually grew progressively in geographic scope and in terms of their mandate. So local peace committees in Sudan were asked by their communities, who saw how successful they'd been in resolving conflict, to take on a much broader developmental mandate. So broadening their mandate, whereas local entities in parts of Central Africa were asked by neighboring communities to please come and work with us as well, because we see how successful you've been in your own community. So therefore, an expansion of their geographic mandate. It's very interesting, that, a very great vote of confidence in the peace building work that they were doing from local populations. We found most initiatives were highly practical in nature. This really stood out. Not only were they cost effective, but they also tended to focus on very practical actions. Rather than the sometimes overcomplicated theories of change, often so favored by external agencies and indeed donors sometimes. And a lot of the impacts were expressed similarly in very practical terms. Things like reduced cattle rates, collaborative use of resources, non-violent elections. Very, very simple, clear, practical ways of expressing impact. Most evaluations ask stakeholders, as is the norm in evaluations, about the relevance of the initiatives they were evaluating, and responses were overwhelmingly positive across the piece, indicating that they were seen as highly relevant by the various stakeholders that were questioned. Local knowledge obviously is the basis of local initiatives, and that's the sort of theory, I think, of why local initiatives are so important. Not surprisingly, what came out of the evaluations was that the local knowledge allowed the initiatives to be very well tailored to the context, but also, almost more importantly, to adapt quickly if circumstances changed. And again, an example from Sudan, there was an example of local peace committees in South Kordofan who changed their priorities very, very quickly, stopped doing one set of activities and moved on to another to help resolve violent disputes that flared up suddenly between pastoralists and farmers and could have and were likely to have got out of control. And on another occasion, a different peace committee in South Kordofan intervened very quickly to resolve problems between a group of refugees and the local host community. So that adaptability was a really important factor for the local peace builders. Peace builders' local knowledge also helped them to bring people in authority along with them, to work with the grain, to change the grain, as people sometimes say. This helped with, for example, getting more women into positions of authority, or getting local chiefs in the DRC to change the approach they had hitherto been taking to justice, to make it more peace promoting. External views of local peace builders can sometimes be prejudiced, regarding them as too simplistic, and this also feeds the skepticism I mentioned earlier in the international organizations. This research, by contrast, shows that local peace builders understand very well that peace and peace building is complex, and that peace is the result of many, often interconnected issues. And finally, in that first column, many of the initiatives had created or restored trust, which implied for me not only that trust is a latent good, not far from the surface, even in complex situations, but also that local actors are well placed to understand how to rebuild trust. Not everything had worked, of course, and the right-hand column lists a few of the challenges identified in the reports that we reviewed. Some initiatives had failed, or at least partly failed, because of overreach. People had taken on simply too much compared to their capacity and the resources they had. In other cases, political interference was said to have undermined the work of some of the local initiatives. A common finding from evaluators was that the reliance on volunteerism raised questions of sustainability. They were concerned that people's commitment would wane in time. Although there were also examples of creative solutions to this, such as in the Congo, where communities had set aside premises for the peace committee's work and even provided them with fields that they could cultivate to generate resources. Also, not all initiatives were as inclusive as one might have hoped. An interesting recent review of a number of dialogue initiatives in Ukraine found them quite often to have inadvertently excluded the very people with the most extreme views whom they had wanted and intended to include. Another challenge was that successful parallel entities, for example, local village peace committees, ended up undermining the ineffective local authorities whose role they had effectively taken over, and that was a thorny problem noted by many evaluators. And finally, thinking again of the columns in our 3x3 table, a large number of initiatives were found to have achieved changes in knowledge and attitudes and in behaviours, in other words, the first two columns, but hadn't yet been able to convert these into sustainable structural changes or norms. This, of course, raised questions about sustainability. So this is the second to last slide, and it's just a few areas for greater support which came out of the data. The report notes that there was a particular need to provide funding and other support to peacebuilding initiatives in contexts where chronic violence was continuing. Much as some decision makers in the international organizations seem to think, or probably think, that you can't really get the peacebuilding done until you've got the high-level peace agreement signed, we have many examples of very successful, quite local initiatives which were continuing and being effective even while the chronic violence was still around in the environment, in places like Myanmar, South Sudan, Yemen, Mali, Colombia, for example. So one thing that came across all too clearly is that local initiatives can and do deliver improvements against a background of chronic violence, even when higher level peace processes haven't yet come to fruition. Many evaluations also recommended that local initiatives either scale up the scope of their own work or link up with others for greater impact. There were good examples of initiatives which had scaled up and which had linked up with others, but it was a very common evaluation finding that there was potential for more, if indeed that's what the local peace builders wanted to do. And then, not surprisingly, the need for additional and longer-term funding was almost a universal evaluation finding, as was the need for more evaluations, especially of higher level initiatives, for example, at the national level, which we didn't find many examples of, and of the less visible or less formal initiatives, things that are peace building, even though the people who do them don't call themselves peace builders. It's quite hard to find evaluations of those. And even though there were good examples of partnerships between international organizations, particularly international NGOs and local peace builders, far too many of these did not appear from the evaluation reports to have provided sufficient autonomy and visibility to the local partners, or at least that's how it appeared from the evaluations. And so, final slide, recommendations. And we, again, I don't think we have anything particularly blindingly new here. I think the data fell into the space we thought it would fall into, in terms of we weren't surprised that there were good examples of local peace building, and we weren't hugely surprised by some of the challenges that came out of it. Anyway, 4 areas of recommendations. One, no one will be surprised to know, increased and sustained funding to local peace builders in ways that respect their leadership and autonomy, and absolutely important that that funding should be as flexible as possible within the boundaries of good stewardship of funding. And the sustained funding seemed particularly important. To move the impact that's already been achieved from changes in knowledge and attitudes through changes in people's behaviours to something which was more accepted and adopted and therefore more likely to be sustained, would take more time. That seemed to be absolutely critical and a very, very common finding. The second area was support and collaborate with local peace builders to help them maximize their direct and indirect impact on peace. For example, by scaling up and or linking up with others, and through technical assistance, for example, providing exposure to peace building knowledge from elsewhere. The third area of recommendation was to support local peace builders who wished to generate and take advantage of learning about what's working and what's not working locally at peace building. For example, fund more evaluations, and it would be particularly interesting to see more evaluations of this idea of peace writ large. So actually looking at, is the situation more peaceful than it was before? Taking the situation as the starting point, and then exploring what are the different things that have happened, what kinds of initiatives have contributed to that improved peace ability, if indeed there is an improved peace ability. And in that, we also talk about the need, going back to what I mentioned before, the need for donors to make sure that international NGOs are more respectful of some of their local partners in some cases. And I'm not saying all international NGOs are disrespectful, but it was quite striking for me personally how many of the reports we had to reject, because it was very difficult to understand if the activities were done by the international NGO who had commissioned the report or the local partner. And it seems absolutely essential that it should be clear in the evaluation who did what. And then finally, the need for donors, multilaterals and international NGOs to look in the mirror, look at their own systems and ask what changes they need to make to their culture, their systems, their ways of working, to enable them to be a better collaborator with local initiatives and provide local initiatives with better support. And again, nothing new about that. So those are the 4 areas of recommendations. And I think there's one more slide which just gives you the, so Peace Direct and Alliance for Peace Building have done a great job here. There's a long version of the reports. There's a sort of an executive summary, which I think is the one in the middle. And then there's actually a website that you can go on and read the reports in a slightly more interactive way. And the web address is on the bottom of the slide there. So with that, I think we can hand back to Jennifer.
All right, thank you, Phil. That was fantastic and extremely informative. Okay, we will now open up today's presentation for our questions. I encourage everyone who has something they want to ask our presenters to write in and let us know. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace so that those who were not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and discussion. And I just want to say ahead of time, if I mispronounce your name or anything to do with that, I apologize. I'm going to first take moderator's privilege and start us off. In addition to what you've already told us, what were any major surprises you had in the data?
So Jennifer, thanks. I mentioned a couple, which is the lack of data on women's initiatives, which really was a big surprise to me. I was also really surprised that, so there are some very famous examples of peace building, which we've all used for years in many cases. And I was fully expecting to be able to get some data on these, some evaluated data on these, and use them as part of the report. Things like the Wajir initiative in Kenya, things like the complex negotiations that took place at the foundation of Somaliland, and also I've often personally used examples that I'm familiar with from my own experience, which I know were highly successful, and I really wanted to use those in the report. But it was so fascinating that when I would go back and look for external or independent evaluation data on those examples, which are so commonly used in books, in talks, in reports, I could find nothing. And I found that incredibly surprising. And it doesn't tell me that those examples are not still good examples, at least the ones I'm familiar with. I know that they were successful. But it does tell me that we still need to do a better job in assembling. It's not just evaluation data, but we do need to do a better job at assembling data and a narrative about good examples of peace building, which people can read and look at and say, yes, that's convincing.
All right, thank you for answering my question. We have a few questions coming in from Steve Martin. Steve wanted to know, what was the general experience level and background of local peace builders? Example, to international organization personnel.
Thanks for that. As the author of the report, I'm not sure that really came out. I mean, I could give you an answer to that, which is just what I think, but it didn't really come out in the data. It isn't something we were really looking at in the data. So I probably think it's better to sidestep that question at this point. Sorry, Steve.
No. Not a problem. We have another question, though, from Steve. Is it a failure of international organizations that evaluations appear to have weak, in quotes, in terms of content and structure?
Well, I looked at over 250 documents, and we only selected just over 50. Quite a few of the ones we rejected were rejected because they were sloppy. They were poor. I think you could tell that they were done on the cheap quite often. But there were quite a lot which were just simply sloppy, and they weren't convincing to a person who hadn't been involved. It's my eye, for example, or the researchers I was working with. And so, yes, that is a weakness, I think. I think if one is going to do an evaluation, it doesn't have to be hugely expensive if it's done in the right way, but it does have to have a degree of rigor. And I think personally, one of the lessons I would take from it is if you have limited resources to do the evaluation, choose a particular part of the program to evaluate, which you can do a good job at, rather than skim across the top with a bunch of anecdotes. An anecdote which is used as the basis for a generalization is not a good way to do it. A generalized finding which is supported with an anecdote is a better approach, I think. So yes, I think we have still some way to go in the peace building sector. Could I just say, though, that I think that having been involved in the sector for quite a long time, I think we have come a long way as well. and evaluations, some of them are very, very good. It was a real privilege to do this report, actually, because I found out about activities I would never otherwise have found out about. And some of them were staggeringly brilliant and very successful. And I only know about that because I've read good evaluations of good activities.
I would just add to that, to back up the point about paying for a good piece of research to be done. I definitely think there's still a bit of holding back with regards to how much we're willing to pay for them. That could sit with organisations, but also I think that there's a little bit of, often in terms of references, not being necessarily that clear on what they're after, or maybe being a bit kind of using the same TOR for lots of different evaluations, even if what you want is something slightly different, and being really, really clear about what you want, and actually accompanying the evaluator throughout that process closer. I mean, from my perspective, I definitely think that's something that I'm not able to do with regards to my workload and time I have with each one, but it would be huge help with regards to the quality. And I think a lot of the time, if something is not done well, it's because of a lack of understanding, mutual understanding.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you, Steve. We have another question coming in from Ryan McClanahan. Evaluations are generally only as good as the monitoring data allows. Did you notice trends in who gathered the best monitoring data and how?
If I did, I'm certainly not going to name names. But I agree with the truism. I think it's absolutely right. Evaluations, it was quite clear that some of the reports had not done much evaluation and had invited an external person to come in and tell them how well they were doing. Others had been gathering information which they presented to the external evaluator, who was then able to use his or her or their time efficiently by verifying and validating those data and gathering more data. It was quite clear that the better evaluations were based on data which had already been gathered and given to the evaluator, rather than just waiting for the evaluator to come in.
All right, thank you. And we have another question coming in from Fabiola Ortiz, PhD researcher on media development at Dortmund University in Germany. Fabiola says, I am interested in hearing from you to what extent developing local media sector in conflicting environments can be considered a complementary tool for a local turn in peace building? Or perhaps, do you think that funding media sector development with locally led actors could also be considered as another component of local peace building?
I mean, from my perspective, yes. In terms of the data that we had for this report, there were one or two evaluations of journalists, journalism, one in Nepal in particular, I remember, and that had achieved some quite significant gains, which were explained in terms of their contribution to peace building, which was convincing to me, rather than that they proved that better journalism had actually, I think, contributed to a greater peace. So I think sort of the theory of change there made sense to me, but I don't recall that it had actually been tested ultimately. But within that theory of change, that having journalists who had better training in conflict sensitivity, which is one of the issues in this case, they were therefore able to tailor their journalism, and the editors also to tailor their editing to make sure that their copy that they were putting out in their newspapers and radios was not going to be causing conflict or contributing to conflict, and therefore the opposite. So yes, there was at least one example in the report of successful media-focused peace building. Might have been others, I can't remember now.
All right, thank you, and thanks again to Fabiola and Ryan before that for your questions. I have one question I would like to ask. After doing this research and looking at over 250 reports and reviewing nearly 60 in detail, as you mentioned, do you have any overall comment about the way local peace building or peace building in general is evaluated?
Well, in addition to the ones I've already made, I think one thing I would say is that it's ironic. So in the peace building sector, it's quite clear to me that we're paying more attention in the sector to evaluation because we must, because we owe it to the beneficiaries that we're working with and for, to make sure that what is being done with them is good for them. So it's absolutely essential to do this, in addition to the fact that the donors need it, which is a secondary issue. However, it's my first time I've spent, 6 weeks doing nothing but reading evaluation reports almost entirely. And it really struck me that the negative side of that improvement in evaluation, monitoring and evaluation, is that some of the evaluations are adopting the rather narrow, slightly facile approach that the development sector already sometimes adopts and loses sight of the bigger picture. And I think we all know that having evaluation data, while absolutely essential, only gives you part of the picture of whether something is working or not working, is relevant or not relevant, etc. And I think there were some evaluations which seem to imply that there's a risk that it becomes a little bit too mechanistic. And so thinking about that, we probably should have made a recommendation about that, that it's really important that evaluations retain the sort of the human touch. These are about difficult to understand trajectories of change, interacting in very complex ways. And it's really important to keep that in mind when evaluating whether something has quote unquote worked or not worked.
Yeah,
Scarlett's going to add something.
I'll just to agree that I feel that they do fall into that quite often. I think lots of that is that, we give evaluators 10 days in the field to conduct that research and to analyze a system, and a really complex system that is conflict context is it's a proper piece of research. You need to do that, and I think that's part of the issue. But on the other side, Peace Direct has definitely over the last year or so tried to kind of build the much more personal aspects into its evaluations, and I think focusing on the kind of case study side of things rather than trying to obtain really rigorous quantitative data that shows some sort of peace building impact is just to kind of accept that's going to show the most change, and that going into detail of each case study and actually seeing how that process works, that peace building process, is much more important. And that may also contribute to why some of the data is really lacking, because that more personal side shows much more for us in the peace building sector.
All right, thank you both for that very detailed response to my somewhat general question. I appreciate it. So we have a few more questions rolling in. We have Zach Tilton of Everyday Peace Indicators, and Zach says, thank you, Phil and Scarlett, which is very nice. Can you speak to the motivation for doing evidence synthesis in the peace building, and what advice you would give to other evaluators and researchers on evaluation on the evidence synthesis process itself?
Sorry, I'm not sure if could you just repeat the first bit of the question, please?
Sure. Can you speak to the motivation for doing evidence synthesis in the peace building, and what advice you would give to other evaluators and researchers on evaluation on the evidence synthesis process itself?
Well, I know Zach, so I'm not surprised that he's asked a question which is too complicated for me to understand. Hi, Zach. I'm not quite sure what he means by evidence synthesis. But I think maybe it harks back to what we said in response to the previous question, which it maybe, if I understand it right, which is that not looking at each piece of evidence by itself, but looking at the whole. Yeah. Was that what it would be? And I would say the motivation for doing that, if that is the point of the question, is something that we probably have to keep reminding people about, because unfortunately, going back to what we both said earlier, I think the message coming from outsiders is quite often the need for mechanistic evaluation.
Yeah, and if that is what he means, the kind of how do you bring a lot of sort of very specific pieces of data together to generalize and to make general recommendations or findings? I think that's something that the peacebuilding sector really has to look at in a big way if we are going to collect data that is so context specific and so case study based. I think it is very difficult, but I don't know Phil's experience of trying to synthesize all that was and how you went through that process of pulling out, you know, findings, as it were, from all of that.
Well, it was, I mean, that's why we created that 3x3 table. I would just say one of our recommendations is the need, well, there's an opportunity if people want to do it, to do context-based evaluations, of which the starting point is not did organization A achieve what they wanted, but the starting point is, has the context moved? To what extent has the context become more or less peaceful? And to what degree can we explain that change in terms of the activities and the contextual factors? Now, there were two big evaluations done in South Sudan and the DRC about almost 7 or 8 years ago, I think, which looked at international, which tried to do a sort of a coordinated evaluation of whether South Sudan and DRC had become more peaceful, and if so, how had the international initiatives impacted that? That clearly wouldn't fit in with what this report's interested in, which is how people in Congo have made a difference, how people in South Sudan, for example, have made a difference. And I don't know of any examples where people have come in with enough funding, enough resources to look at an entire context. It may not be a country, it may be smaller than that, and say, how can we describe the difference in this place from how it was before in conflict and peace terms? And then use sort of, what's that phrase, appreciative inquiry, to try and understand how these changes have happened and why they happened, and then learn something about the way different actors have behaved that could really be helpful in the future. Over.
All right, thank you. And Zach confirms that, yes, that was in fact what he meant by the question, so good job. We only have a few minutes left, but I think we have enough time to squeeze in one more question from Ryan McClanahan. Did you notice any major differences in success rates between your 3 domains or 3 levels of your framework?
Differences in what? Between the
Sorry,
levels?
yes, I said that fast. Differences in success rates between your 3 domains or 3 levels of your framework.
Well, I think on the top line, the x-axis, yes, there were far more examples of changes in knowledge and attitudes, roughly the same number actually of changes in behavior. But possibly not quite as convincing, and then less examples of structural normative changes. And then across the 3 domains, if that was the other part of the question, no, actually, I think I was expecting there would be less examples of violence prevented, reduced, or stopped. That's often what people talk about when they talk about negative peace building. I thought there might be less examples of that, but there were plenty of examples of that, especially at the local level. And there were also plenty of good examples of improved horizontal relationships and improved vertical relationships. People are happy with those terms. So the real gradation was from left to right in the levels, but not in the 3 domains.
All right, thank you. So we just have enough time for a few closing remarks from me. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and everyone who asked questions, and sorry if we didn't get to you. You can continue the conversation online. So again, thank you everyone for joining this edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. The recording will be posted online on the M&E Thursday Talk discussion page later today so that you are able to return to it and share it with your colleagues. Please continue the discussion online in the comments. As for our next M&E Thursday Talk, we'll be back at the start of August for a month full of insightful discussions. So keep an eye out on our emails, social media, website for more information. And I wanted to say thanks again to Phil and Scarlett for your wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I will talk to you soon. All right, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.